Welcome to the Deep Dive. We explore fascinating topics in depth for you. Today we're tackling something really fundamental, the concept of reality and illusion. We had a listener ask about understanding these core ideas of existence, so we've been digging into the collected works of Sri Ramana Maharshi.
Yeah, it's quite a text. It offers this really remarkable perspective on what we think is real versus what might just be, well, perception. Our mission today is basically to unpack these big ideas, try to make them clear, engaging, and give you something to really chew on about reality itself.
Okay, let's dive right in then. So a really central idea here is this deep connection between our true self, often called Atman, and the ultimate reality, Brahman. The text proposes they're not actually separate things at all.
Exactly. Verse 9 puts it super clearly. What is called the heart is no other than Brahman.
Now, when we hear heart, usually we think, the physical organ pumping blood. But that's not quite it here, is it?
No, not at all. In this context, the heart is much bigger. It's seen as the core seat of the self. It is Brahman, essentially. Think of it as the absolute essence of our being, our consciousness, the fundamental ground of everything.
Okay.
Verse 17 actually gives a pretty good way to visualize this, if that helps.
Yeah, the lamp analogy. I remember reading that. How does that work again? How does it help connect the self and Brahman?
Right. So it compares the ether, like the space inside a lamp's flame, to Brahman, which it calls knowledge ether. So just like the physical ether fills space both inside and outside the flame with no real boundary. Brahman, this sort of all-pervading knowledge or consciousness, exists both within ourself, in the heart, and, well, everywhere else, seamlessly. It shows how Brahman is totally encompassing, but also intimately part of our innermost being, like the ocean and the waves, maybe. Brahman's the ocean.
Okay, that helps make that vastness feel a bit more connected to us. But then verse 18 brings in the three states we experience, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and also the three bodies. The gross physical one, the subtle one, and the causal one. How do all these different things fit into this single, unified self-light? It sounds like a lot is going on.
Yeah, and that's a really key point. This is where the idea of illusion starts to become important. These states and bodies are described as appearances within that one self-light. The light itself is just steady, self-illuminating, unified. To try to explain how this one self seems to experience all these different modes, the text uses this really detailed analogy, a lamp in a house.
Okay, a lamp, a door, doorstep.
Yeah.
Yeah, lay it out for us. How does that work?
All right, imagine the self as the lamp's constant light. Now, sleep is like the door. The doorstep, called Mahat Tattva, is maybe like the first stirring of potential experience. Nescience, or ignorance, linked to the causal body, is like the inner wall. Then the ego acts like a mirror. The five senses are the windows. Deep sleep, where we're basically just the causal body, that's the inner chamber. Dreaming, the subtle body state, is the middle chamber. And the waking state, with the physical body, that's the outer court.
Wow, that's quite a setup. So how does this explain the self staying constant while all these experiences are happening?
Well, the analogy shows the self, the lamp, just shines continuously in that inner chamber, the causal body. The experiences, waking, dreaming, sleep, and the ego, they seem to flicker on and off as the sleep door opens and closes, influenced by things like time and our karma, our past actions. The ego, the mirror, reflects the self's light and projects experiences out through the senses, the windows, into the dream and waking states. But when that sleep door closes, the ego sort of fades. And waking and dreaming go with it. You're left just with the unmoving self, the fundamental reality. So basically, this whole elaborate picture is saying all these different facets of our experience, waking, dreaming, body, thoughts, they're like different rooms or reflections lit up by the same single light of the self. The light itself doesn't change, just what it shines on.
Got it. So these states and bodies are like temporary projections, reflections in the ego's mirror, all powered by the constant light of our true self. And this feels like the perfect lead into the concept of Maya, right? Because this sounds very illusory.
Exactly, precisely. The text brings in Maya as this power that makes what's unreal seem real. Things like the individual soul, the jiva, the world as we normally see it, even God as some separate being. Maya makes these appear solid, real. And conversely, it makes the real, the self, seem unreal or distant to us. Verse 5, who is the author of Maya, talks directly about this.
It's like a grand illusion making us buy into something that isn't fundamentally true.
Spot on. And a huge part of this Maya is ignorance of Jidya, or Ajnana, they call it. Verses 38 and 39 explain that forgetting our true nature, the self, is this sort of veiling power. It leads directly to the mistaken idea, I am the body. Even though our basic sense of I is always there, our understanding of what that I really is gets clouded, limited.
So we end up identifying with the temporary stuff body ego instead of the permanent self. And how do the world, the individual soul, and this idea of a separate God fit into that illusory picture then?
Verse 16 of Who is the Nature of the Self clarifies this. It says, the world, the individual soul, jiva, and God are appearances within the self. The analogy used is like seeing silver in a piece of mother of pearl.
Ah, right. The shimmer looks like silver, but it's just the shell.
Exactly. The mother of pearl is the underlying reality. The silver is just a temporary perception superimposed on it.
Yeah.
So the takeaway is kind of like, you know how a movie screen isn't changed by the movie playing on it?
Yeah.
Our true self is like that screen. It remains unaffected by all the changing experiences of life playing out.
Okay, so the self is the foundation, the screen, and everything else is like these shimmering temporary appearances. Now, this leads to something I think is tough for many of us. The feeling of agency, of action. We really feel like we're the ones doing things.
And that's presented as a major hurdle to self-knowledge. Verse 23 of How is self-realization to be affected? Really flags this up. That deep-seated feeling, I am the doer, I am doing this, creates this false sense of separation and, a burden of responsibility based on that ego.
We feel like we're making the choices, we're causing things, but the text says that's maybe not the full picture.
Right. It uses this analogy, a government treasury officer. It's quite good, actually. The officer handles huge sums of money, right? But they stay detached because they know it's not their money.
Okay.
Similarly, the idea is we can perform our duties, the actions we need to do, without clinging to the idea that we, the ego I, are the ultimate source of the action. It's kind of wild to think that our sense of control might be part of the illusion. I mean, I definitely feel like I'm driving the bus most days.
Huh, yeah, me too. So it's about acting, but without attachment to the results or that feeling of personal command. And what about people who have gained this wisdom? How do they see action?
Well, verse 25 of How can cessation of activity suggests that for a wise person, actions really only exist in the eyes of others. They understand that activities just happen, they unfold within their mere presence. They're more like a silent witness to it all.
That's a huge shift from how we normally operate. Like the universe is doing its thing and we're just there observing, not directing.
And didn't the text use the sun as an analogy for this too?
Yeah.
For God's action?
Yes, exactly. Verse 17 of Is not everything the work of God? It compares God's presence, which is actionless, to the sun rising. The sun doesn't try to do anything. It doesn't have desire or make an effort. But just by its presence, things happen. Sunstones catch fire, lotuses bloom, water evaporates.
Right.
In the same way, the idea is that all actions occur because of God's silent, pervasive presence, but without God having any personal intention or getting tangled in karma. This is, pretty mind-bending. So, okay, if our usual reality might be illusory, what does the text suggest we do? How do we figure out what's real and what's not?
The primary practice, the one really emphasized, is self-inquiry, asking that fundamental question, who am I? Verse 10 of How will the mind become quiescent? And verse 30 of Reality and 40. Verses both point to this as the main way to dissolve other thoughts and actually realize the self.
It's a constant turning inwards, isn't it? Not looking outwards for answers.
That's verse 11 of What is the means for constantly holding on? Kind of walks through the process. When other thoughts pop up, which they do, instead of following them down the rabbit hole, you ask, okay, who is having these thoughts? The answer that comes back is obviously me.
Right.
Then you push further, who am I? By persistently asking this, the mind gets redirected back towards its source, the I. And that initial thought starts to quiet down. The idea is, with practice, the mind gets better and better at just abiding in that source, in the I.
So you trace thoughts back to the I that thinks them, and then investigate the I itself. What about meditation, Deanna? Does that come into it?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Verse 31 of How is one to think of the self? And verse 7 of the 8 Limbs of Knowledge talk about meditation, Deanna, as training the mind to take the form of the self. The ultimate goal there is to directly experience what they call the I, this pure awareness shining in the heart, which is Brahman.
And samadhi. That's often mentioned as a really deep state.
Verse 8 of the 8 Limbs of Knowledge describes samadhi as going even beyond that I manifestation. It's the quieting of even the subtle sense of I, leading to a very direct, non-conceptual experience of reality. But interestingly, verse 16 of What are the factors to be kept in view in dhyana? gives a warning. It says, don't get sidetracked or deluded by visions or strange sounds that might come up during meditation.
Oh, okay.
The instruction is to remain steadfast, focused on self-absorption, not on phenomena.
So the key always seems to be turning inward, deeper and deeper, and not getting caught up in the sideshows, whether external or internal. Now, the guru figure is really important in many traditions. What does this text say about the guru's role in helping us sort out reality from illusion?
It's an interesting balance. The text acknowledges that the ultimate guru is actually one's own self. However, verse 4 of If It Be True that the guru really emphasizes that for someone caught in ignorance, the grace of an external guru is often crucial. The jiva, the individual soul veiled by Maya, usually finds it really hard to recognize its own true nature without that external guidance or catalyst.
So the guru is like a guidepost, pointing us back towards our own inner truth.
Precisely. And the text suggests the guru's mere presence can have an effect, helping to quiet the mind's chatter and showing the limits of just intellectual book learning without that direct self-knowledge. Wisdom, then Viveka, is defined in verse 20 of What is the Sign of Wisdom as basically staying free from delusion after you've realized the truth. And liberation, Moksha, verse 40 of Reality in 40 Verses says, is essentially just the extinction of the ego and realizing the self that was always free anyway.
Wow.
In fact, verse 13 of If That Is So are not all efforts. Goes even further, suggesting that terms like bondage and liberation are just words, linguistic conveniences that lose their meaning once the true self is actually experienced.
That's pretty radical. Even the concepts of being bound or free are part of the illusion until we wake up. Okay, to help us get our heads around all this, the text uses quite a few analogies, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Analogies are super helpful for these kinds of abstract ideas. We already touched on the silver and the mother of pearl one.
Right, showing how the world, soul, God appear and disappear in the self.
Verse 16 of Who is the Nature of the Self brings that up.
And the cinema analogy, I found that one really clear.
Yeah, that's a great one. Explained in verse 13 and a table after it in Since the Self is Free From, the self is like the projector lamp, the source of the light. The mind is like the lens and the film rolled together, holding all our latent tendencies, our vasanas. And the world we experience is the movie projected onto the screen.
So the self just illuminates. It's not affected by the drama on screen.
Exactly. It shows how our core awareness, the self, stays constant and untouched by the ever-changing movie of our thoughts, perceptions, and life events.
Okay, that makes sense. The movie plays, but the light source is unchanged. And the dream analogy, that also emphasizes how temporary our waking reality might be.
Verse 1 of 5 Verses on the Self compares waking life to waking up from a long dream, one where we've wandered through countless births. Just like the dream world vanishes when we wake up, the idea is that our perceived waking reality also dissolves when we realize the self.
And the classic snake and the rope analogy, that fits here too.
Definitely. Verse 27 of the Crown Gem of Discrimination uses it. Mistaking the jiva, the individual self, for the tree self causes fear. Just like mistaking a rope for a snake in dim light causes fear. But when you see the rope clearly for what it is or realize the self, the fear just disappears.
Okay, so pulling this all together, this deep dive into Ramana Maharshi's work points to the self as the fundamental unchanging reality. And this illusion of a separate world, a separate me, arises because of ignorance, Maya, clouding our perception.
Right. And the main path to cut through that illusion, to tell the real from the unreal, is this practice of self-inquiry, who am I? Turning attention inward. Guided by wisdom, maybe by the grace of a guru, but ultimately it's an inward journey.
It really seems like these concepts of reality and illusion are tied directly to our perception, and especially to identifying with things that are, well, temporary, our body, thoughts, ego, instead of that underlying eternal self.
Precisely. It challenges our most basic assumptions about who we are and what the world is.
So here's something to maybe mull over. Consider for a moment, what parts of your own experience do you hold as absolutely rock-solid real right now? And how might that view shift if you consistently, genuinely inquired into the I that holds those views?
Yeah, it's a powerful question to sit with.
This deep dive is really just scratching the surface, of course. If these ideas sparked something for you, we definitely encourage exploring the source material or related teachings further. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.